Hello everyone and welcome to the Green Man channel. Hope you're doing good and well. So it's time for another symphonic metal video here on the channel. And I'm talking about a band I feel have been slightly lost to the sands of time, and that band is After Forever, a symphonic metal band from the Netherlands that were formed back in 1995. And it's perhaps surprising that this band have actually been slightly lost to the sands of time and are in the shadows of other bigger names in this genre. When you think of the original lineup and who is in this original lineup, and when they obviously first properly formed in 97 with Floor Jansen, you think you've got her in the band here, you've got Sander Gommans, and you've got Mark Jansen, another big name in the mix here, who later went on to form Epica with Simone Simons. So you can see the original lineup here is quite a force of talent, and it's somewhat surprising that after the band disbanded in 2009, this band don't get a hell of a lot of recognition. Certainly, I don't see this band talked about much, or when I'm having conversations about symphonic metal, they're rarely brought up. Nightwish obviously tend to dominate symphonic metal as a genre, but so do somewhat other bands in this genre, like Within Temptation, In This Moment, Epica, and so on and so forth. After Forever, I feel like with some of what they put out as well, there's some great records here I'm going to be talking about very shortly and covering each album in chronological order of release date, giving each record a score. And then after that, I will sort of try to cover why I think this band don't get a lot of attention, or at least not the attention I feel they deserve, or the recognition. I think there are a few different reasons for that, actually, and I will touch on those reasons at the very end of this video. So, After Forever originally formed, as I say, in 1995 under the band name Apocalypse. They were actually a gothic metal covers band at that time, apparently. I didn't know them at that time. They later in 97, when they recruited Floor Jansen as singer, became more symphonic metal aligned, more of a symphonic gothic metal kind of a band, and then started composing their own music, and later in 2000 released the first album I'm going to be talking about here, which was called Prison of Desire. Now, this for me has, it's kind of a strange record to me, because on the one hand, I think that there are some outstanding moments on this album, but it also doesn't have a lot of cohesion about it. For me, it's a little bit of an angular record to listen to. There's some great moments, but there are also other moments on this album where I tend to drop out of the record a bit as well. So it feels a little bit inconsistent, perhaps a typical kind of debut record from a promising band, this one. Maybe, you could compare this a little bit to Within Temptation's Enter. It's like the band finding their feet, but I would say this is a better record than that on the whole. It does show off the band's talents well, the potential of Floor, the work of Mark Jansen here coming to the fore, him showing what would later come with Epica. Overall, it's still a very solid record. I enjoy the likes of songs like Following the Cry and Beyond Me, that actually features Sharon Denadel, incidentally, from Within Temptation. So I'd give this one a 7 out of 10. I think it was a very solid start, but, this was more of a warm-up for me from what was to come with album number 2, which I'm going to talk about next, which was released in December of 2001. This is a fantastic album called Decipher, which is, for me, really their masterpiece, their piece of magic from this band, where it was like everything that was sort of forming from the first album really kind of became more grounded. The foundation was there. It was like just the magic happened with this record, with the songwriting, with more consistent, well-produced tracks, the use of the choir, certainly elevating that sort of grandeur of this album, along with Floor's voice, which on this album is, can move mountains. It's so good at times. I love Decipher. I particularly love tracks like A Pledge of Allegiance, Part 1, and Intrinsic, which I think features some of Floor's more stunning moments on the record vocally. I would undoubtedly give this record nothing less than a 9 out of 10. So a 9 out of 10 is what I'm going to give Decipher. One of my all-time favourite symphonic metal albums, with good reason. It just has, the sort of interesting compositions, the stunning vocal moments, the grandeur that symphonic metal brings along with it, and the consistency from track to track with what it brings musically to this kind of a sound. Next up, I'm talking about the album after Mark Jansen sadly departed the band for reasons which I'm not sure I fully have kind of uncovered exactly what happens with Mark Jansen's departure, whether he really was actually dismissed or whether he left of his own accord. But apparently it was all due to musical differences. and the band kind of wanting a more direct, aggressive, concise approach to the music, Mark wanting something a bit more expansive, with what of course he did when he formed Epica with Simone Simons and they released The Phantom Agony in 2003. You could see where After Forever might have otherwise been going. But what's interesting about this to me is that, not initially exactly, because Invisible Circles, their third album, released in March of 2004, I felt was kind of a little bit like an Epica album in some ways. You know, it had a very sort of storytelling type narrative, sort of a very dark theme actually of dysfunctional families and child abuse. So, you know, there's that too. And it's sort of had this kind of running narrative through it, a concept album. Quite complex compositionally, I think, as well, and a little bit like what Epica were actually to become later. So it's kind of interesting that you kind of had, for me, reading up about After Forever wanting to be a bit more concise and a bit more to the point and direct, yet Mark wanting to take things more in a more expansive direction with Epica. Yet it's kind of like initially that kind of didn't happen so much with After Forever for whatever reason. Later it did with albums number 4 and 5 in After Forever's discography, but with Invisible Circles I feel like that was certainly an interesting record to put out and to have come out after the departure of Mark Jansen. So yeah, like I say, it's a dark record for me. It's a little bit bloated, it's a little bit overstuffed, I think, with ideas and narrative moments and storytelling spoken word moments that I didn't feel helped the album musically and sort of took me out of the album quite often when there are some really good songs here, you know, and still overall a solid, interesting record that for me doesn't quite reach the dizzying heights its predecessor did, nor does it quite have the consistency of quality of Decipher. But still, Invisible Circles is actually, in and of its own right, a very interesting album with lots to uncover and to unravel. Highly still recommend you check this one out. I'd still give this an 8 out of 10, which is a great score. And it does have still an abundance of good moments contained within it. Now, their fourth album is next up, Reimagine, released in September of 2005. And this was very different to Invisible Circles. It's like the band said, well, let's take this in the direction we want to go. They went more accessible, more of a cleaner approach to the music, I would say, for a bit more of a rock sound with this record. And the kind of album cover, I feel like, kind of give that away. Not one of the band's best album covers, personally, I don't think. But you know, it's a solid record. But I feel like this was certainly not as good as Invisible Circles to me, nor was it as good as Decipher. Perhaps a little bit of a step back for the band, maybe, whilst they were kind of finding a bit of a new sound. In a way, like Prison of Desire was for Decipher, a bit of a warm-up album. It feels a bit like Reimagine was a warm-up for their final and fifth self-titled record that came out in 2007. Of course, that's going to be the next album I talk about. But I do still enjoy parts of Reimagine tracks, for example, like Free of Doubt, the sort of more ballad-like, strong, and Face Your Demons is a really good song towards the end of the record. It's just them moving slightly more in an accessible direction. But you know, this album also, I think, suffers from a weak production. Like, certainly the layers and the different elements of the band here don't all feel fully joined up and composite. It just feels a little bit messy in terms of its production for me. But all changed with the next album, and sadly their last album, the self-titled record from 2007, which I think is a really great record. It's more bombastic, it sounds epic, it is symphonic metal getting towards its very best. The band, I think, have here found their footing from maybe just going slightly off piece with Reimagine. Absolutely love tracks like Evoke, Energize Me, quick to the point symphonic metal tracks. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's what Nightwish often do with their earlier albums, and it works incredibly well. You've also got a more progressive epic on here, Dreamflight, which I highly recommend you recommend you check out. It's a highly engaging, interesting song throughout its almost 10 minutes length. Features an absolutely gorgeous operatic moment from Flora in the middle of the song, which you absolutely cannot miss if you're a Flora Jansen fan. You know, she does tend to do big vocals with Nightwish, but you hear some of her more operatic ability, I think, with some of these After Forever albums that you may otherwise miss out on if you just listen to some of her Nightwish records and works. Overall, this is a pretty spectacular album for me, certainly one of their best. Whether it's quite as good as Decipher, I would say maybe not, but it is overall a really consistent record, this one. I'd give this an 8.5 out of 10, so it would probably rank second if I were to do a discography ranking for this band, which I pretty much have here. You can guess my ranking from these scores and mini reviews for each record. So yeah, I think the self-titled album is an absolutely fantastic After Forever album. So that leads me to sum up, after having gone through this band's discography, touching on their history a little bit, not going into great detail, but why don't they get the recognition that they deserve? And I feel like, well, there's one very obvious reason, which is the band disbanded in 2009, when I think like other bands were really kind of getting bigger and bigger in this genre. You could also argue that Mark Janssen's departure did the band no favours, really, because he went on to become quite successful with Epica, and they're now widely talked of at this point in symphonic metal as being, what I regard as the holy trinity of the symphonic metal scene, along with Within Temptation and, of course, Nightwish. And I feel like After Forever's, having that bit of, having Mark Jansen depart, and he is a force, he is a talent, I think, really amazing songwriter, and to lose him, I feel like didn't do the band favours as such, as much as Sander Gommans is fantastic, and obviously you still had the power and the strength and performance of Thor in the band too, but I feel like that didn't exactly help them, and also just that, over time, I feel people just generally won't check out this. You hear Floor Jansen talks about, now everyone talks about Nightwish. Nightwish are the biggest name in this genre, and most people, as much as you can talk about the history of symphonic metal and other big names in the sort of original era of this genre, it's nearly always the big names that will get all the attention inevitably. And After Forever, again, for that reason, I think, do tend to fall within the shadows of symphonic metal, sadly. But don't let that take away from what I think of as, a lot of quality material in this band, in their later albums as well. I still think there's a lot of good stuff. Their self-titled album, I think, is a terrific album you need to check out if you haven't already. Like I say, Decipher is a masterpiece in this genre. If you have never checked out Decipher and you're a symphonic metal fan, you really are missing out by not checking out that record. That's an absolutely fabulous album. And yeah, I think it's a shame. I think had they stayed together, maybe they would have become, post 2009. I think with the self-titled album showing what they could do in their later years, they could have still gone on to become bigger and to grow as big as a band like Epica, Mark Jansen's projects after Forever. I think had they stayed together, maybe they would get more of the talk now. But, you just don't see this band, as I say, talked about much in symphonic metal circles. I certainly don't see many reaction videos to After Forever songs. That seems very rare. On all the reaction channels, it's always Nightwish and Epica and maybe Within Temptation somewhat. But you don't really hear, you don't get much After Forever. So for all those reasons, I just think this band have been slightly lost to the sands of time. But in no way do they not deserve, they absolutely deserve the attention to be given a bit of a spotlight now, I think, in hindsight, with, some of these records, which I think are really just deserve that sort of attention that bit more. So yeah, that's it from me. Hope you enjoyed the video. Do drop a like and a sub if you enjoy my content. Let me know in the comments you want to hear me talk more about symphonic metal. It does always seem to be the thing that people like to hear me talk about at the moment anyway. Otherwise, from me, until next time, is bye for now.